Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. Today we're going to talk a little bit about store-bought kombucha and my opinion of it. So a few people have been asking me, you're a proponent of home brewing kombucha. Are there any store-bought kombucha brands that you like? Do you ever buy store-bought kombucha? Are you vehemently against store-bought kombucha? And I just figured I would just come on here and chat a little bit about my opinion of store-bought kombucha brands. And I will say that there is no one-size-fits-all kind of approach that different commercial brewers take to their brewing process. So this is definitely not meant to walk you through all of their different processes and how they all work, because they all have different methods to producing commercial kombucha. But what I find is that if you can, I always recommend that you buy local and from craft brewers where you can actually get to know the people behind the operation. You can ask them questions about their process. They should be really eager to share details with you about their kombucha brewing process, because if they aren't, that's a good indicator that they probably have something to hide, because brewing kombucha is actually a really simple process. It's simple enough that you can do it at home, and you can watch my YouTube videos to find out how to do that yourself if you're interested. But there are obviously also a lot of good reasons to buy store-bought kombucha instead of making it homemade. I am not against store-bought kombucha. I'm not against commercially brewed kombucha, and I do often buy some when I don't have any homemade kombucha on hand, or if I'm taking a road trip and I didn't bring any homemade kombucha with me. These two are actually my favorite brands that I prefer buying. I'll buy Hum whenever I can find it at the store, and if there isn't any Hum, I will buy Health-Ade. These are my top two favorite brands of kombucha because I generally find that they taste the best to me, and Hum has been really transparent about their kombucha brewing process, and so I really like brands that are very forthcoming about that information. But again, always recommend buying local if you can, supporting small businesses. There isn't really anything inherently wrong with larger scale commercial brewing operations, and I will add the caveat that the things that I'm about to say don't necessarily apply to all commercial brewers, but I find that in order to preserve consistency across their product, there are a lot of commercial brewers that have to take additional steps to process the kombucha in a way that homemade kombucha brewers don't need to worry about, because this is just a homemade product that you're going to be drinking yourself. And so you might notice that if you're a homemade kombucha brewer, you'll find some differences between the homemade kombucha you make and the kombucha that you make and the kombucha that you buy from the store. Things like if you use fruit purees and fruit pulp, I always end up getting some sediment at the bottom of my kombucha brews. I personally don't mind it. I don't mind just drinking it. If I have guests over, they're weirded out by the pulp, I'll strain it for them right before they drink it. But if you are buying a commercially produced bottle of kombucha, you'll probably find that there isn't SCOBY growth in there isn't sediment, and that's could just be because they went through the process of actually filtering the kombucha and making sure that all of that pulp and sediment is filtered out. But there are also instances where some brands that try to masquerade as kombucha don't actually go through the fermentation stage. They don't actually ferment the process. They basically just take black tea and then add specific strains of yeasts and probiotics to it. So you can't really call it kombucha. It's more just a probiotic beverage. If there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it's just not kombucha. It's just black tea with some added probiotics to it, or green tea, whatever tea they might be using. And so when you're looking for good options for store-bought kombucha, I would recommend doing some research. The reality is that I've actually looked through a lot of these different brands' ingredient labels, and there are things that just seem a little fishy to me. Things like adding stevia to the brew. I don't really understand the need to add an additional type of sweetener when, one, the kombucha culture doesn't thrive on stevia. In fact, stevia actually kills the kombucha culture in the long term because it doesn't give it adequate nutrients to ferment. So anything that has stevia on the label is a little fishy to me, because one, I don't really need any added sweeteners to the kombucha if it was properly fermented using sugar. It doesn't really need stevia. And then two, if they're adding extra probiotics to it, that's also fishy to me, because the whole purpose of undergoing a fermentation process is to create naturally occurring bacteria and yeast that are live cultures in the brew. And so if you see that a brand is adding additional cultures, that might be a good indication that they have pasteurized the brew in some way. I've actually spoken to some commercial brewers and other brewers who are familiar with the brewing industry, and there are some kombucha brewing operations that will go through the process of fermenting kombucha properly, but then they will pasteurize the product, which is a little baffling to me. And if you're a commercial brewer and you're familiar with this process and can share more details with me, please reach out, because I am really curious about this. But they take their finished fermented kombucha and they pasteurize it to basically kill any potential harmful pathogens. So if there are any contaminants in the brew that could be harmful, they go through the pasteurization process to basically kill off the bad bacteria. But the issue with pasteurization is not only does it kill the bad bacteria, it also kills the good bacteria. So if you go through the process of making kombucha and there's a bunch of like live beneficial bacteria and yeast in the brew, and then you just completely pasteurize it and kill all of those bacteria and yeast, I don't know why you went through the process of fermenting it to begin with. Especially if you were now just going to add back in specific strains of beneficial probiotics. At that point, that to me isn't really kombucha. To me, that's just a beverage, and it might be delicious. It might be a delicious beverage with added probiotics to it. And so if you're really just interested in the probiotic of the beverage that you're drinking, then this may not matter to you. But it does make me wonder, why go through the process of making kombucha if you're just going to kill the thing that makes it kombucha and then add something else to it that you don't need to add if you were making kombucha the right way. So that's my issue with some of these kombucha operations that end up doing that. And then you may also hear about, there are a lot of kombucha brands that have an over 21 version and one that anybody can buy regardless of how old you are. And that's because over the course of the fermentation process, kombucha can get alcoholic. There are trace amounts of alcohol in many fermented foods. I will say that from a home brewer's perspective, it's really difficult to get to a point where the ABV, or alcohol by volume, of your brew is such that you'll feel any sort of buzz. But I also am cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of people who have very legitimate reasons for staying away from alcohol altogether. So that's a personal choice and completely fair. And the thing that store-bought kombuchas have over homemade kombucha is that these are federally regulated. So any kombucha that you buy from the store has to be below the federal ABV legal limit. And so if you're concerned about alcohol consumption and you want to make sure that you're not consuming any alcohol at all, then the safer bet is definitely to go for the store-bought kombucha, because this is regularly tested. They have to uphold those regulated standards more so than a homemade batch of kombucha that you'd made yourself, where it's really not worth the financial burden of getting your kombucha tested at a lab for alcohol. I will also say that I'm based in the US, and so these federal regulations are really only specific to US law. I'm not familiar with other countries, so if you find that your experience is different elsewhere, I can't speak to that. But I will say that in order to conform to a lot of these rigorous federal legal limits, a lot of commercial brewing operations have had to add additional processes to their brewing operation to ensure that their brew doesn't exceed that federal legal limit. So some commercial brewers might water down the product. Some of them might use yeast inhibitors to prevent ongoing fermentation. And I'm not saying that these things are necessarily wrong or bad for you, but they are an added process that doesn't necessarily exist in a home brewing environment. But all that aside, what I will say is that to me, it really just comes down to taste. I happen to really love the way my homemade kombucha tastes, and there really isn't anything on the market that comes close to how good homemade kombucha tastes for me. I also happen to experience a lot of the purported benefits whenever I'm feeling bloated or if I'm having gut issues. I find that it really does help me personally in that way. And that's what makes homemade kombucha so exciting to me, is the fact that not only is this, in my opinion, way better tasting than really anything that I can find at the store. But it's also a really fascinating process to immerse myself in. I know exactly what's going into the product. I know exactly what's happening to it. I can control all of these variables so that if I want it to be more fizzy, less fizzy, if I want a specific flavor, if I want it to be stronger tasting or more potent, or if I want it to be mellower, these are all things that I, through understanding the kombucha brewing process, can really fine tune in a way that you can't really do when you're just picking something off the shelf. Another factor is the cost of it. I did the math a few years back, and when it comes to homemade kombucha, I think it comes out to about 25 to 50 cents per bottle in hard material costs, including the fruit flavorings that I use to flavor my kombucha. So for me, not only is it a better tasting product, I have more knowledge about what goes into it, but it's also significantly more cost effective for me personally. So if that's something that factors into your decision at all, not necessarily one better than the other, it really is just a taste and preference type of thing. And if you have the interest in learning how to brew and make kombucha yourself, I really hope that you'll check out the other resources on my YouTube channel. Check out all of the free information that I share at youbrewkombucha.com. And if you're interested in picking up my book, The Kombucha Crafter's Logbook, that's a really helpful way to track your kombucha brews, and there are additional resources and charts and troubleshooting tips in that book as well. So I hope this was really helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Happy brewing.